Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Paul Blair. I'm the CEO of Infrastructure New Zealand, and I wanted to welcome you to another one in our webinar series. Today we're being joined by Minister James Shaw. Mr Shaw, the Minister for Climate Change, Statistics, and also our Associate Minister of Finance. So really unique position to talk about transitioning to a productive, equitable and sustainable economy. So I'm sure that you're all highly familiar with how Zoom works by now, but the very brief overview is please use the Q&A button to send your questions through. We will be running a couple of polls today before I introduce the Minister. That'll give the Minister a good sense for who's in the room and some of the levels of understanding that you have on key issues. The format for today is a brief introduction from me. Then, as I said, we'll do some polls. I'll introduce Minister Shaw, who will do probably 5 to 10 minutes, particularly focusing on the budget and what it means for those outcomes of, productivity, sustainability, our climate change pathway, and what it might mean for the further investments that come beyond the budget as well. We've then had around about 12 questions that have come through from you prior to the webinar. Obviously, we'll moderate those along with any others that you might provide. And we'll look to wrap this up at around about 1:45. So it'll be nice and snappy. We will encourage you to use that Q&A function. Today, we're trying something a bit different. You'll be able to like questions and they'll promote them further up the queue. So please use that for some interactivity, and that'll help us out get the most important questions to the top of the queue. So without further ado, I'd now like to talk about the Honourable James Shaw. So Minister Shaw has been a member of the Green Party since 1990. He has a background both here and in Europe in management consulting, community organisations, impact investment, a deep understanding, but also passion for the green economy, which is partly what we're talking about today. Before we hand over to the Minister, as I said, Tara, I'd like to start off by running a couple of polls for you. So if you could just cue that up for us, that'd be great. Right, so the question is, following the budget and what you've seen from the government about the post-COVID rebuild, to what extent do you think we're on the right pathway towards a low-carbon economy? I can see we're up about 115 of you today, which is a good turnout. We clearly haven't gone past peak webinar. We had Minister Megan Woods and Andrew McKenzie on last night. Hopefully, as the numbers build, Minister, we'll beat them out. You can see we're just over halfway. We'll give you another few seconds to go there. Already a bit of a trend, unfortunately, not so much in the definitely bucket there, Minister. All right, I think as we get to 80%, Tara, I think we can probably cut that off around about there and look at that. So interesting results. I'm not sure, Minister, if that's going to be surprising to you, and perhaps I'll come back and we can talk about that shortly. So a bit lower than we would like on that. Tara, I think if we could just get the second question queued up now, that's probably a follow-on from this. So to what extent do we consider that climate change mitigation, for example, reducing emissions, or climate change adaptation, e.g. building for sea level rise, a bigger priority for our infrastructure? For a bit of context, Minister, we have 5 policy priorities and 5 themes that we focus on. The first theme that we have for Infrastructure New Zealand is actually climate change adaptation. We had climate change as a discussion point, and we really thought it was more about adaptation for us, but quite a discussion there. See that we're about 2/3 of the way through, so wait for you guys to just get a few more there. Just crossing over 80%. So I think we can probably cut that off around about there, Tara. That gives us a good snap. Equally important, so $1 each way for 57% of you, that it's important to do all of those things. And I think that as I was discussing with the Minister earlier, as Minister for Statistics, I think the role of information is going to be quite important in this going forward. So thanks for that, Tara. If you could just drop that down for us now. So now, without further ado, about 5 minutes into it, welcome again to all of our participants. It's a really broad audience. I've seen those of you who are attending today. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Minister Shaw, and if you could take us through your address. Thanks very much.
O tēnā koutou katoa ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good afternoon, and Paul, thank you to you and the team at Infrastructure New Zealand. I think it's really helpful for me to be able to spend time engaging with your members about budget issues in general, but also the overall direction of travel. We do, as a government, have a huge focus on infrastructure, and we're going to be relying on your sector tremendously over the course of the next few years. So this is a pretty important series of conversations to kick off. What I'd like to do is just to talk a little bit about the structure of the budget, because I think that will help people to understand where we are in the process and resolve some of the questions like you had in the mail out that you sent, which said, how can we become more productive, sustainable, decarbonised, inclusive and resilient? Minister will outline progress on New Zealand's climate change pathway and provide the vision for the New Zealand economy. So in order to be able to answer that, I just want to talk about how the budget has unfolded and how it is going to continue to unfold, because it is structured quite differently to previous budgets for obvious reasons. So back in January, of course, we announced the New Zealand upgrade, an infrastructure spend of $8 billion with an additional $4 billion in additional capex allowances to go into the budget as well. That was at a time when we had well, first of all, we knew we've got an infrastructure deficit in New Zealand. Second of all, the global economy was slowing down, and we had a sense that we were going to need to inject some stimulus into the economy. So that was the context we were operating with that package then. So that's kind of part one of the budget, because that was accounted for in the budget that we presented last Thursday. The second main component of the budget is what we call the cost pressures budget. That is essentially last year's budget, so that roughly $100 billion that we spent last year, plus inflation, plus population growth, plus funding for policy decisions that we had made. So during the course of the last 12 months, a series of decisions were made that needed to get funded. And if we hadn't put money in the cost pressures budget, then, well, there wouldn't have been much point making the policy decision. So that was the kind of the core piece of the budget. And a number of the big announcements that you would have heard on budget day last week came out of that component of the budget. The third component, which in many ways is the most significant, is the $50 billion COVID contingency fund, the recovery fund. And so that actually just appears in the budget as a single line item, which is the recovery fund, 50 billion. And there are three components to I guess three sets of decisions drawing down on that contingency. And you will have heard Grant talk before about the three waves of the government's response to the COVID pandemic crisis. So wave one is fighting the virus and cushioning the blow. So there was a significant injection into the health system to get things like PPE, testing kits, you name it, personnel call-ups, all sorts of things. So quite a lot of money went in for that. There's also the decisions that we made around things like the wage subsidy, which is probably the single biggest ticket item on the budget line, stretching to something like $10 billion so far, and so on. So a series of decisions that were made well in advance of budget day itself, but which are drawdowns on that $50 billion. Those things in that first wave came to something on the order of $15 billion by the time we got to budget day. Wave two of the response is really the kind of near-term need to focus on jobs. So there are kind of four thrusts there. One is trying to keep as many people in their jobs as possible. and that's where things like the extension to the wage subsidy scheme came in, small business loan scheme, the various other support structures that we're putting in place, which seem to be doing a reasonable job under the circumstances, but there are probably still some gaps in that response, and also it's never going to be able to keep everyone afloat. So we're kind of doing what we can to smooth that impact out. So keeping as many people in their jobs as possible. Where that's not possible, retraining and getting them into new jobs as fast as possible. So, for example, free apprenticeships, free vocational training at polytechs, that kind of thing, in order to transition people from work that they've just recently had into new lines of work really quickly, and in particular in areas where we know that we're going to be investing and where we know we need people. So, for example, builders and people to work in the construction sector. The third component is unemployment support, so recognizing that there is going to be a bounce in unemployment in the coming months, and just making sure that people are able to put a roof over their head and food on the table during that period of time. So things like the doubling of the winter energy payments, indexing unemployment benefits to wages, the $25 a week increase in base benefits, those kinds of things are there to try and support people who are in the unfortunate position of not working. And then the fourth area is direct investment in new jobs. And that is both working directly for the government and then the government, essentially purchasing into the private sector. So the thing that got the most reportage last week in that domain, of course, was the $1.1 billion for Jobs in Nature, which is a series of different programs run by Ministry for Primary Industries, Ministry for the Environment, Department of Conservation, really working in partnership with councils, iwi and hapu, environmental NGOs, community groups, farmers, agricultural organisations right across the country to work on various kind of remediation projects, whether that's wetlands or predator control or fencing, riparian planting, you name it. And one of the reasons why we kind of went large in that domain is because obviously the areas which are tourism hotspots for the country, or at least were tourism hotspots 12 weeks ago, are in areas of outstanding natural beauty. And so the location of those jobs, conveniently, is in the exact locations where we're seeing really big spikes in unemployment due to the downturn in the tourism industry. So there is a sort of a transferability there. Also, because those programs essentially build on work that we've been doing for donkey's years, means that we're just scaling up programs rather than trying to start something from scratch, which is obviously a lot harder to get going. So those are the four components of the sort of the second phase, and that's where most of the budget was announced last week. So that was of that $50 billion. Like I said, we'd spent roughly 15. Last week we announced another $13 billion drawdown on it, and that was phase 2. So that leaves about $20 billion in the tank to allow us the flexibility to make decisions as circumstances change. And that is really one of the key things here, is because we do not have perfect information. The situation has, shall we say, emergent properties, and we can't really predict, if there's another significant outbreak, that's going to lead us in a direction. If there isn't another significant outbreak, but we have to keep our borders closed for a really long time, that's going to lead us in a direction. So we wanted to give ourselves quite a lot of flexibility to, over the course of the coming 12 months, be able to make some pretty significant decisions. But also, within that is wave 3 of our economic response. And we only really hinted at that last week, and we didn't make any significant announcements about that. And wave 3 is really thinking about the future economy. So 12 to 24 months from now, as we emerge out of the kind of crisis phase, what sort of economy do we want to have? Recognizing that the economy that we have had, there's no going back. Even if we wanted to, it's just going to be fundamentally different from the economy that we're going to have in the future. So we therefore might as well make some really wise decisions about what that is. Now, we couldn't put that together in the 8 weeks that we rewrote the entire budget from scratch, using a lot more noughts and commas that we had in the previous 6 months. And so, partially we've got to give ourselves time to do that work well, and not to do it with the pressure of, needing to fight a pandemic crisis at the same time. And partially, like I said, because we want to be able to allow ourselves to have some sort of the emerging, emerging situations. Now, one of the things I said in my budget speech last week is the money that we are spending, we are in effect borrowing off our children and probably our grandchildren, to tell you the truth. And we therefore have a responsibility to invest that money in things that are going to benefit them. And every dollar that we borrow from them to get us through this crisis is a dollar they can't spend to get them through another crisis, like the climate crisis or the housing crisis, or the crisis in our rivers and our lakes and our streams and our marine environment. So those are the things that we should be putting that money towards. Otherwise, they end up with a double whammy of having to pay back the debt from our crisis, plus pay for the transition and adaptation costs for the crisis that they'll be dealing with. So it's, in my view, an absolute responsibility for us to invest in those things where we know that we've got long-term challenges that those future generations were going to have to deal with anyway if we didn't deal with them. And first and foremost amongst those, and most expensive amongst those, is the climate crisis. So that then leads us in a direction of saying, well, what are those things? Because in the sort of incremental business as usual world that we've just left behind, there are things that we just couldn't do because incrementalism wouldn't give us the, we only have social permission to do so much. We only have the fiscal headroom to do so much. And therefore, we're kind of doing tweaks that would try to point us in a direction, shift the dial. Now we're in a situation where there is a requirement for us to stimulate the economy with very large sums of capital. What are the things that therefore become possible because you're in that situation rather than in that sort of more incremental situation? And there, obviously there are things in the domain of energy, transport, our three waters infrastructure, housing, I think I mentioned transport, and so on, which do require large amounts of capital to get done, very long work programs over the course of the coming decade, which would keep people, will get people into work, would stimulate the economy, would solve some of those future problems, and ultimately would have, I think, quite a significant return on investment for the country, and help to pay down the debt that we're running up to get us through the pandemic crisis. So that's, I guess, my philosophy. Now, is it going to happen? I don't know. Cabinet has yet to make decisions about which domains we're going to start putting money into. And I think this is one of the areas where I would quite like to call on you, Paul, and your members to start saying, look, I mean, to me, this is actually just economic rationalism. Let's put it into these areas. The sector is ready to go, or it can adapt to get ready to go within a reasonable time frame, and maybe with a bit of support or whatever needs to happen to help kind of transition from one kind of domain to another. And that, I think, would be quite compelling for ministers who are having to make these decisions in the coming kind of weeks and months, because there will be probably a couple of drawdowns before the election. They might not be all that large comparatively, because like I said, we need to leave plenty in the tank for the whole coming 12 months. We don't want to spend that all at once, but we do need to start investing in those kind of big transition projects, because so far the response has been just getting us through the public health crisis and trying to soak up as much of the economic blow that is associated with that as possible. You're on mute, Paul.
Oh, am I? I am.
No, you're back. No, you're good. You're all good now.
I think I had a battle with Sally, who's in behind there. So, but Minister, thanks very much. I mean, that phrase, sort of borrowing off our children and grandchildren, is one that I've actually heard from our members as well, and particularly our younger leaders actually are highly concerned about that. So look, one of the first questions I'd like to ask, and I see that we're starting to get some questions coming through and liked, which is great, but it's actually one of the questions is around frameworks and decision criteria. So, you know, our organisation actually called for a sort of a fairly pragmatic, low complexity, job-focused budget, but that we reserve the fiscal bazooka for transformation. Could you maybe talk about what thinking is happening about a transparent criteria for the use of that fiscal bazooka, and on what basis you make those sorts of trade-offs and long-term decisions?
This is a piece of work that Phil Twyford is sponsoring as the Minister for Economic Development, and so in terms of policy work, MB are leading on this, and I know that they are receiving quite a lot of input. A reasonable amount is from me, but they've received, like for example, Dr. Rod Carr, who's the chair of the Climate Change Commission, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, sent a letter to ministers saying, look, here are 6 criteria for how we want to think about these investments. They're principles based, quite straightforward, but if you embedded them, would make a significant difference in terms of the direction of travel. So I know that is part of MB's thinking, and you know, we've done some other work as well. There's been some fantastic private thinking that's been done that's, you know, come in, which we're trying to feed into the process, and we've sort of got, you know, we can do a negative screen, so you just knock out projects that you think are going to lock us into a high emissions pathway or going to make us less resilient over time, and then also a positive screen, which, because essentially this is a should we say a buyer's market at the moment, because we've got a lot of proposals for how to spend money, is to say, okay, well, of the things that we haven't knocked out, which are the things that, you know, are going to deliver greatest value for money over the coming decades. But I can't say specifically what those criteria are, because Cabinet hasn't yet received the paper to say, you know, to propose what they would be.
Can I just follow that on though? So in that value for money is often a bit of a default in that we're focused in those 4 well-beings on the economic only. One of the challenges I hear is actually valuing the other 3 well-beings. So again, is there a shift towards explicitly valuing those other 3 well-beings because we've tended to default to economic only?
Yeah, I mean, I've been quite critical of previous stimulus packages in response to previous crises, because they have tended to be very short-term and kind of jobs at all costs. And then all costs end up exceeding the value of the jobs that you created in the first place. And actually, you could see from the Christchurch rebuild some of that thinking coming through, where, you know, once the stimulus of the kind of reconstruction projects had faded out, there hadn't been sufficient thinking about, well, what was the economic activity that was going to sit on top of that? So even before Christmas, before COVID really reached our shores, you could see in the Christchurch and Canterbury region, they were actually slipping towards towards negative growth, and I think partially that's because, in large part, actually, that's because the thinking 10 years ago about the stimulus package wasn't sufficiently long term. And I think that there are enough people around in Treasury and in government and in the private sector and in councils who lived through that, and, you know, we're close enough to that set of decisions to be able to say, well, okay, well, let's not do that again. So I am feeling quite hopeful about this, and I do think, in particular at Treasury, the work that has been done through the budgeting process on the wellbeing budget, where we've got these 5 capitals approaches, does mean that there is a level of thinking about that. Now, it's not a perfect science; it's pretty rough and ready, but it's a lot more rigorous than we had, you know, 3 years ago.
Yeah, encouraging to see the finance minister say if your house burnt down, you wouldn't necessarily build the same house back, you might build back better. But a question here around Christchurch Hospital development today, which sort of looked a bit more like a lower price decision. We've been calling hard for sort of social procurement, more on resilience, and so on and so forth, decarbonisation. Do you see evidence of that coming through or not?
Let's just say it's unevenly distributed.
So what do we have to do to get the decisions that may be being said at the top level? Often they come through to mid-level, particularly procurement departments. How do we get control of that?
Well, so I think there's a couple of things. One of which, again, we've actually done quite a lot on procurement over the last couple of years because, I think it would be fair to say that New Zealand has historically had a pretty purist or simplistic approach to it, which is lowest cost, is the interpretation of best value. And we have been building in expectations for things like whole of life cost as opposed to just upfront capital cost, for sustainability and as you say, social procurement things. Also, the what halo effect can we create through our procurement, given that we purchase $40-something billion worth of goods and services every year? Like, let's use that to the best economic effect, social and environmental and economic effect we can. So I think that is slowly pervading. And my sense is that where you detect that that's not been lived up to, that you get in touch with the government and say, hey, I can see some kind of decision making here that I don't think matches your policy, and it's because we don't, like, as ministers, you don't necessarily see that. So I think that would be helpful. I think the other thing is the extent to which you can line up with other actors in the system. So I know that the Infrastructure Commission and the Climate Change Commission are talking very closely. It's convenient that Alan Bollard and Rod Carr both served on the Reserve Bank together and know each other pretty well. But if you can kind of dock in with them and then with other sort of actors in the system, like the Sustainable Business Council or the Climate Leaders Coalition, which many of your members are also members of, and kind of get everyone sort of saying the same thing, it becomes a lot easier for ministers to say yes. But when you get kind of large players pulling in different directions, that, frankly, policymaking becomes quite difficult in that sort of environment.
Yeah, I understand. I'd just make a call for the Commerce Commission, perhaps, as one of those actors. That regulation's another tool that I don't think have made enough of. But look, a popular question here is around a lot of green jobs coming in the latest budget around sort of conservation and rivers and stream remediation. Have you got any views on jobs to be created by any new decarbonisation activities like green energy, green buildings, carbon capture?
Very much. And that's, so like I was saying, so wave two, the reason why we went with such a big investment in jobs in nature in wave two, like I said, was because we had existing programs that we can scale up. Yes. They are in regions where it's, where it's needed. And because of the distributed nature of it, it's actually, it's easier to get the money out the door than it is with kind of a sort of more kind of big hero projects type stuff. But clearly, the big transition stuff is yet to come. And so we know, for example, that more jobs are created per dollar spent in housing construction than in horizontal construction. Yeah. Now, we need a lot of horizontal construction, right? So I'm not shying away from that. But it does give you a sense of, okay, well, if one of the things that we're trying to do is to create jobs, let's make sure that jobs intensity is one of the key factors in our decision making. Not the only one, but one of them. And actually, things like building houses, retrofitting houses, sticking solar panels on houses, commercial building retrofits, some forms of transport infrastructure are, conveniently really jobs intensive. And so you can sort of create a triple win here of, fixing some long-term challenges, creating quite a lot of jobs, and doing the stimulus, economic stimulus and supporting industry all at the same time. So I don't want to get too specific, like I said, because I'd be getting people's hopes up, and B, Cabinet hasn't made any decisions, and so therefore I'd be in a position of probably letting a whole bunch of people down. But like I said, in the domains of energy, housing, transport, three waters infrastructure, actually fresh water as well, agriculture, there are areas where we all know that we were going to need to inject a significant amount of capital over the coming decades anyway, just because we'd failed to do so over the last 3 decades. and so conveniently, oddly, ironically, we can actually take the opportunity to do that in a way that helps us to prepare for the future much more effectively than if we'd spent the money 30 years ago when we should have.
Yeah, fantastic. And just a couple of questions that came in before this session that ally to that. So sort of a bit of a trade-off between the government picking winners versus the government creating the right conditions and incentives here. And also thinking about economic tools. So the emissions trading scheme, Lake Taupo nitrogen scheme. What's the balance here? Pick winners, create conditions so the market does it.
Well, I don't think it's an either or situation. I think that there's a bit of both. So, look, it is something that we're very mindful of. We don't want to crowd out private capital if there's private capital that's able to move into some of these areas. But in some cases, the sheer scale of what we're talking about is something that we can do that virtually nobody else can do. And that's also not to say that we can't do it together, right? There might be sort of a different mix of how you do it, and I think in different it's different in different sectors. If you take waste, for example, you can run commercial operations in waste. You can find capital to put up to build the facilities and the infrastructure to start with, but it all relies on a regulated and subsidized marketplace, and so you've got to get the investment and the regulation lined up so that it makes it work. And if we actually want to fix the waste problem in New Zealand, it probably requires government capital to be a reasonably large participant in getting up from a base of, frankly, close to zero to something approaching half decent in an OECD sense. So but that would be different from, say, in the electricity market, where we've got a well-functioning market, and with a few changes to the way regulations occur, that government capital is probably not really required. So I just think it's different depending on which sector we're talking about.
So having a look at the transport sector then, have you got any thoughts again on encouragement for changing our fuel mix, electric or hydrogen, use of RUC, or road pricing as well seems to be a great tool to have a go at there. What are we got to do to finally get this done?
Oh, well, I have an impolitic answer to that. And it involves an election campaign. Look, I mean, it's an area of government policy that's been stuck, and we're kind of struggling to make progress on. So I have many thoughts about what we could do there, and my experience is that those thoughts are pretty well supported by industry. So I don't think it's going to be a terribly hard problem to solve once we can get past the sort of political impasse. But it is an area of some frustration to me. We should have made a lot more progress on that in the last 2.5 years than we have.
Yeah. So just following that on then, in order to get urgency, the same sort of urgency in climate change that we have managed in COVID, I think it's surprised many, government and private sector, how fast we've been able to move. How do we make this move faster? And again, you're Minister of Stats. What is the role of information in this transition?
Can I just say it didn't surprise me terribly much. Well, I guess as climate change minister, I'm sort of used to sitting here going, hey, this is a massive catastrophic crisis. Why aren't we dealing with it? I think human beings are extremely well equipped in an evolutionary sense to deal with a very clear and present danger. So we, lion runs out of the bushes. We can cope with that. We're terrible at the kind of parable of the boiling frog type, slow emerging crises, just hopelessly equipped to deal with those in an evolutionary sense. And so you're right. I think information is critical because you need to be able to generate the same kind of sense of alarm at one level to get the cognitive juices flowing to the point where it's like we're actually going to deal with it at the crisis of the scale that it actually is. Yeah. And so actually a lot of the work that I've been doing in stats has been trying to make sure that we do have a much more comprehensive dashboard for how we think about the well-being of the country. So first thing I did actually as Stats Minister was to start a project called Indicators Aotearoa NZ, which was to say, well, if the government's sort of data sets have emerged as a product of history, so entirely ad hoc, and different agencies have collected data for their purposes without actually joining those up to be able to say, well, this is the whole thing. So I said, okay, well, if you were just to put all that to one side for a moment and say, if you actually wanted, in the same way that a company would do a balanced scorecard type arrangement, if you actually wanted a comprehensive suite of economic and social and environmental indicators to give you a sense of the whole picture of how we were doing, what would that look like? Stats went away and developed that and came back with about 124 kind of reasonably high level things, each of which has data around,
Are you there, Minister Shaw? Well, this is the first. We've been doing this for a long time, and it's the first time I think we've seen a freeze in our national system. We'll give you a couple of minutes to come back. So just while we're waiting for Chorus to come back through, I think there's probably just a couple of other things that are coming around. The Minister has obviously touched on the transport sector. I think the other sectors that we'd love to talk to him about, if and when we can get him back, is in the water space, the housing space, energy, and also some questions coming through from George and Janet here that effectively are around the spatial planning space. So, see if he's coming back on. There he is.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I think you must have enthusiastically leaned in at some stage.
Yeah. No, it's ultra fast broadband. It's got holes. There's a problem. If someone in the room can fix, that'd be great.
I happen to know someone on the line who might be able to do that.
Can you give them my number afterwards? So I don't know at what point I froze up there. What was the last thing I said?
I think we sort of moved on. You talked, and I'm conscious of time, you talked about there's energy, transport, water, and housing. We've probably mentioned transport. There's really energy, so the role for renewable energy in the grid, and then water and housing, I think would be great if you could go.
Yeah, look, I have to say all of those are on the table. I just, like I said, ministers haven't made specific decisions about any of them yet, so it would be out of place for me to, to say where we wanted to go. We did put in last week's budget $500 million of operating into housing, which enables a further $5 billion worth of borrowing at Kāinga Ora, which enables us to build the additional 8,000 houses that we were talking about. So, that was a pretty big chunk there, saying we're going to spend $5.5 billion on housing. And then I know we didn't say anything about water or waste or transport much in last week's budget, but those are all things that we're actively considering.
So a question, the ultra-fast broadband, notwithstanding our little glitch, the taxpayer actually spent very little in order to get an awful lot by providing incentives and by really taking off some of the demand or uncertainty risk. Have you considered any instruments like that for things such as climate transition?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I mean, Crown Infrastructure Partners, Mark Binns has been responsible for putting together that project list. And we asked them to do it precisely because of the experience of the ultra-fast broadband project. Again, those vehicles differ a little depending on which sector we're talking about, because obviously there'll be horses for courses. But no, we're kind of keen to explore those. And I know that there are moves afoot, shall we say.
So in the water space, this is one that's always been controversial, but it's another public health area where New Zealand's really underperforming, which is
Yeah.
shocking given our resources here. I know that this is in train, but it did seem that there was a sense that there would be reform in the water space. Is there anything that you can talk to about that?
No. Only because it's under active decision making at the moment. So it is pregnant, shall we say?
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right.
And I just want to credit Nanaia Mahuta. I think she's done an amazing job over the course of 2.5 years of really methodically working through this in policy terms, looking around the world, working with councils, kind of laying the groundwork. And I think that we'll see some movement in fairly short order.
And just you mentioned councils, and I agree, Minister Mahuta has done a good job there. But again, some discussions coming from members. It appears that there's sort of an all of Wellington and then an all of local government response happening.
Yeah.
And that's because of different revenue models, not really aligned. Sometimes it's a problem of scale. Sometimes it's a problem of local politics. Do you have any views on how we can join the streams and get an all of government response happening better?
Look, I mean, I think what we've done is we've sort of said, well, let's bite off the water problem in this term, because that is vast, and every council is struggling with it in their own way, and I think that that's where we're looking at how do we get to a point where we can use scale to create solutions we previously wouldn't be able to, and so on. We have done some work on things like how councils get funded and so on, but I think reform is on that domain is probably going to have to wait until the next parliamentary term, because we are rapidly running out of runway.
Final one, renewable energy is obviously a massive opportunity. Do you think you've got the right settings in that energy space? Grid investment, carbon pricing. What do we need to do there, Minister Shaw?
Well, there's a number of things. I mean, we are making progress on the reforms to the emissions trading scheme, and that will help undoubtedly once those come through. And you can actually already see the market in advance of the legislation kind of starting to make decisions, which is great. We clearly have not got the regulatory settings right. And I say clearly because we have nothing like the investment in some domains of renewables where price actually is comparable, and yet it's not really moving. Now, part of that's historical because, of course, for about 10 years, we had flat growth, and so no one was really investing. But actually, since the Interim Climate Change Committee came through and said, well, decarbonising the economy equals electrifying the economy, and therefore you need to expand your electricity generation by anywhere from 70 to 100%. All of a sudden, it becomes quite an exciting investment opportunity again. But I don't think that we've got the market settings quite right for that, and that's because ultimately they're a product of their time, which is sort of late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
And there are some things that we need to change there in order to free that up.
Yeah. And Minister, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about our favourite piece of documentation, the Resource Management Act. So, Tony Randerson review, very, very complex, very intertwined system. We've got a fast track process there.
Yeah.
Have we got the balance right of practicality and long-term reform there?
Yeah, so there's actually three things, right? So there's the Randerson reform, which is actually the blank sheet of paper, and what you could see come out of that might be a complete rewrite. It could be a repeal and replace. It could be anything. And so, but that by definition, that is therefore a very long term piece of work, and it's worth taking it slow and doing it well. Yes. There is the second set, that the kind of near-term reforms that David Parker's pushing through now. In fact, I think it's literally coming out of select committee this week, or possibly next week. And so that'll go through second and third readings sometime in the next couple of months before the election. That includes some really good things, but again, they are largely kind of stopgap until we get the big reform. Then, of course, also in response to COVID, there is this fast track process, which is a piece of legislation which is basically designed to create a system where we can make some decisions very quickly in order to do some projects over the course of the next 24 months as part of the economic rebuild. And I intend, and I think that we've managed to get the design of that into shape so that those will, it won't just kind of go back to your old, kind of status quo type projects, but that'll go towards things that actually do make a long-term difference.
Yeah, I think one of the key things about the resource management system rather than the RMA is that we've been hostage to a noisy few against the needs of the many, and that's something that we have to crack through. So,
and I think everyone recognises that, and it's just how do you? Because at the same, the flip side of that is you have to protect minorities as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, it's complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
So look, Minister, I recognise that you'll be out of time, but I just wanted to wrap up there. Thank you very much for your time. Always candid, great to talk to you and hear a bird's eye view. I like that piece of social permission plus fiscal headroom equals opportunity for change. I think that's a great line. We're a proud partner with the Sustainable Business Council, and there's some people from the Climate Commission on this call. We've set up a thing called Vision Week, which is going to run from the 8th to the 12th. We've sought someone from your office to get you involved in that, actually. But we think it's time to have a bit of a discussion about the new New Zealand and some of those things such as sustainability and inclusion and so on and so forth. So for those who are on the call today, please take a look out for that on the 8th to the 12th of June. But Minister, I just wanted to thank you again for your candour. It's great to have the bird's eye view. This is complex. But I think the thing to leave with is that a pragmatic budget that solved as many problems as it could in 8 weeks, I think we really need to seize the opportunity to transform with that $20 billion bazooka and other things to come for what we need New Zealand to be for our grandkids. So thank you very much to you and to our members on the webinar. We'll have this up on our website later in the day.
Great.
Thank you.